Welcome to episode 220 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Mark Sewell, who served in the FBI for 20 years. He spent his career in the Atlanta division, initially assigned to an organized crime squad for 10 years, before transferring to the Gainesville Resident Agency, where he worked on the Safe Street Task Force for another 10 years. Mark was also a member of the SWAT team. In this episode, Mark reviews several stolen valor cases, including the investigation of Shane Ladner, a police officer who was accused of lying about receiving a Purple Heart and who benefited financially from the deception. In 2013, in the wake of the tragic school shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary in Connecticut, Mark became one of the FBI's first certified active shooter event instructors. For 5 years, he taught police response to an active shooter event in 10 states and several African countries. Since his retirement, Mark has been working as a contract intel instructor at the FBI Academy in Quantico and operating I68.org, a firm providing active shooter event consulting to churches and workplaces. I want to dedicate this episode to all of the women and men who have served and are serving in the military. But before we get to the episode, we got to take a moment to celebrate. This month, January 2021, I am celebrating 5 years of podcasting. Yep. 5 years ago, in January of 2016, I posted my very first episode. Thanks for listening. As part of the celebration, will you tell a friend or two about the podcast? You do that for me, and I'll do something for you. I'll post 3 episodes instead of 2 this month. And that extra episode at the end of the month? How about I interview retired FBI profiler John Douglas? I'll be asking him about Mindhunter, the book, and the TV series, and he'll be reviewing the investigation of Joseph Paul Franklin, a white supremacist whose Nazi-inspired beliefs propelled a 3-year reign of terror across the United States. A serial killer and a racist? Wow, that's my worst nightmare. So that interview's coming up at the end of the month on January 27th. But before we get to today's episode, did you get my January reader team email? I decided to focus the email on frauds and scams. So if you don't want to be scammed, please be on the lookout for my email. If it's not in your inbox, you know what to do. Check your spam filter. Of course, I want to welcome new listeners and invite you to join my reader team. This podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my monthly email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, which is a colorful list of more than 50 books about the FBI written by the FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoir. You can join my reader team on my website or use the link in your podcast app's description of this episode. I want to thank you for your support. Now here's the show. Oops, I forgot to tell you one last thing. We had some technical difficulty, so Mark had a call in and his audio is a little muffled. Sorry about that. I want to welcome my guest, Mark Sewell. Hi, Mark.
Hello, Jerry.
Well, I am glad to have you on the show because I've always been fascinated with the topic of stolen valor. As a Marine vet yourself, you were able to investigate several stolen valor cases. So I guess the first thing that we should do is to explain to everyone what stolen valor is.
Well, the term itself was coined as recently as 1998. A Vietnam vet turned author named B.G. Burkett wrote a book of the same name called Stolen Valor. And the purpose of his book in the late 90s when he wrote this was to defend the Vietnam generation. What he found in the media was that every time somebody did something crazy with a handgun or a homeless guy on the street that did something crazy, they were always lumped as Vietnam vets. Vietnam vet shot up the post office. Vietnam vet did this. Vietnam vet did that. Well, he got to looking into these alleged Vietnam vets and found out that in fact, it wasn't what the media was claiming. They had maybe been discharged early from the military and never served in Vietnam, or maybe they went to Vietnam and never saw combat, or maybe they were never even in the military at all and they had lied about it. And as he started getting into this to defend the Vietnam generation, which he felt was getting a bad rap, he started finding all of these stories of these lies that people were telling about themselves. And with that comes the medals and the valor that maybe they had alleged they had earned while in the military. And that caught on, that theme and that defense of the military caught on by the readers. And the term stolen valor was kind of born from that, from the title of his book. And of course, in the book, he tells other stories about people that he just kept running into that were telling lies. But stolen valor is exactly that. It's claiming military medals, military service that was never earned in an effort to either gain financially from it or gain from our egos and from our wanting attention from the public. So it's really that simple.
Well, the reason that this means so much to me is that I am a military brat. My father was in the Air Force for 21 years. This was a FBI investigative program that I really wanted to highlight on the show. So thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, sure. I'm glad to talk about it. I found that a lot of people know the name Restoring Valor, but not a lot of people, including agents, know the specifics and how it works and some of the techniques and tactics we can use to prosecute these cases. So I'm happy to talk about it.
All right. So before you get into the cases, could you do me one more favor and talk about the FBI's jurisdiction?
Well, forever and a day, starting in 1948, the only law on the books that the FBI could use to prosecute these kind of cases was simply an impersonation of a government employee. It was a Title 18 U.S. 912, and we had to prove that the person that was doing the impersonation was gaining financially from it. So, maybe they lied on an application saying that they had worked for the government and therefore they got a job because of that lie. And so therefore they get something of value. I actually used that impersonation case back in 2001, right after 9/11 in a case. So it still works even today. So that's the first foot in the door that the Bureau has. And then I mentioned the Burkett book earlier. There was another book written in the mid-2000s called Restoring Valor by a husband and wife team named Doug and Pam Sterner. And what they do is they tell their story of how they worked with their congressman in Colorado to draft what became known as the Stolen Valor Act, because other than this impersonation law from 1948, there was nothing on the books that could really specifically work for the military and specifically with medals. From that effort in 2006, Congress passed what's known as the Stolen Valor Act, which made it a felony for claiming unearned medals, specifically in service that was never earned as well. Well, as you can imagine, that made its way through the appeals courts because people started challenging that. There was a case out in California that involved a man that claimed to have earned a Medal of Honor and had been a retired Marine Corps colonel. Well, he pled guilty to both of those claims, but during his guilty plea, they made one note, if you will, that they were going to appeal this, and so they were going to suspend sentencing until it ran its way through the appeals court. That he had a right as a colonel, he has a right as an American citizen to claim that he was a colonel and to claim that he was a Medal of Honor recipient under the First Amendment, freedom of speech, that it protected speech to lie. And there were two appeals courts in the United States that one heard this case and another heard a similar case, and they both were split. One upheld the act, the other appeals court overturned the act. So eventually it made its way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled in 2012 that the Stolen Valor Act was unconstitutional, that you and I have First Amendment right to lie about military service and medals earned and et cetera. Now, what the Supreme Court did during their opinions is they gave Congress a little bit of a hint on how they should go back and rewrite this law, and they did. And the hint was that Congress needed to tie this to a financial benefit, that the lies equal a financial benefit. So in 2013, the next year, Congress redrafted the law, passed it, that you cannot claim medals and service and benefit financially from it.
So in that situation, the financial benefit makes it a fraud.
It is. It makes it basically a financial fraud. You're right. And you'll see where this will eventually, if you don't already see it, you'll see where it's going to go. When I tell you the next sentence is that when Congress passed this in 2013, this new redrafted Stolen Valor Act, they made it a misdemeanor. And nobody understands exactly why that, maybe to keep it from being appealed in the appeals courts and so on. But as one prosecutor told me once, it's now basically a Nerf hammer. That it's, who wants to prosecute a misdemeanor, right? Especially at the federal level. But that's what it was. And that's still on the books today and has not been challenged. There is one other violation that's also on the books that's not in the stolen valor theme specifically, but in 1995, Congress made a law that they could only authorize a particular company to produce the Medal of Honor. And it's called the Medal of Honor law. So any other company that produced medals of honor for collection or display or military collectors or things of that nature had to identify this as not an original, not authorized, that it was a replica, that it wasn't an authentic Medal of Honor. Well, as you can imagine, some of these companies just decided to skip that part of it, and they tried to represent a lot of these medals, and they still do today. People make medals and represent them as legitimate medals of honor that can be traded and bought and sold and et cetera. And of course, that is a violation of the 1995 Medal of Honor law, which is a Title X law, which covers the military. Title X does, and it has not been overturned, so it's still on the books. And there's been bureau agents, specifically Tom Catone, now retired, up in the Boston area, that was hot and heavy on that law, because the company that manufactures, that was authorized by Congress to manufacture the Medal of Honor, was actually in the Boston area. So he worked to defend that law. Because this is a misdemeanor, what U.S. attorneys' offices and what the FBI is doing now is that we're really attacking these crimes as financial crimes or some type of fraud crime. And we're calling them stolen valor cases. But in reality, the bad guys are not pleading, or the bad guys are not getting convicted of this Stolen Valor Act, which is a misdemeanor. They're getting convicted of financial fraud or wire fraud. Good old-fashioned fraud cases that are being labeled as stolen valor cases. So that's where we're at as far as the Bureau having responsibility and ability to tackle these.
That's very interesting that you said that, because, when I was looking for images to, promote this episode, I went online and I put in Purple Heart and found that Purple Hearts are being sold on Amazon and other sites with a fancy little velvet lined box and everything to go with it. And I was shocked.
Yeah, there are collectors out there that have, just legitimate, sincere, and honest motivations to collect medals. And then there are guys that want to buy these and put them on their chest and walk around with them as well. All the medals in the military inventory are allowed to be sold and traded and manufactured, with the exception of the Medal of Honor. That's the only one that can only be produced by one company, and it's controlled, and it can only go to a recipient. Now, what the recipient can do with it after he receives it, technically, is still be determined. Whether he could sell it if he chose to, kind of like selling your Super Bowl ring, which people do. You've heard those stories. Of course, the Medal of Honor is a lot different. That has not been challenged yet, but that's the only way that a person can be in possession of a Medal of Honor is if it's come from a particular company and it has been awarded to them by Congress and the President.
All right. And one last question before you get into the case reviews. What is the difference between a Medal of Honor and a Purple Heart?
Medal of Honor is the highest medal in the U.S. military, and it's awarded for extreme acts of bravery and valor on the battlefield. I don't know the exact numbers, but the Medal of Honor Museum is located in Charleston, South Carolina, which is where I went to college, and I go back there often and I visit. It's located on the Yorktown, which is part of a museum floating flotilla there in the Charleston Harbor. And I believe at any given time, there's about 300 living Medal of Honor recipients in America today at any given time. So that is the Medal of Honor. And there's a pyramid of rankings of the medals within the military, and it sits at the top. And then next would be the Service Cross for each service, such as the Navy Cross or the Army Cross. That would be the second highest award. And then third would be the Silver Star, for example. And then this pyramid just keeps going down. And somewhere down in, probably 10 or 15-ish is the Purple Heart. And the Purple Heart is not awarded per se because of an act of valor. The Purple Heart is awarded because you have been wounded by an enemy combatant in combat. And I'll talk to you a little bit later about how you earn a Purple Heart, because that came as a specific part of one of these cases. But generally and specifically at the same time, it is just simply, I've been wounded in combat, and my nation recognizes that and bestows me a Purple Heart.
All right. Now that we're educated, where do you want to start?
Well, first thing I think is important to say is that there have been agents during my career and even today that are still working these cases. And if you know where to look online and you search for it and read the headlines, you'll see these cases are still out there. Mike Sanborn, I spoke to him on the phone recently retired out of WFO. He was the Medal of Honor case agent as well because of his proximity to the Pentagon. So there's an active open case at WFO that just works Medal of Honor frauds, specifically the Medal of Honor. Down here in the South, I helped to cover some leads for Tiffany Baker out of the Columbia Division, who worked a fantastic case against a person who committed just an egregious crime that we'll talk about later. And then just in the last 6 months here in Atlanta, and one of our RAs, John Goodpaster, prosecuted and got a plea out of a guy that was bilking the VA for federal military benefits, claiming that he had been in the service and claiming that he had been wounded and so forth. So the fraud was in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. So those cases are ongoing every day, and those are just a couple that are easy to find that I was aware of and so forth. But my involvement started back in 2001, and it was right after 9/11. And maybe you had a similar experience that people got taken off of their squads that they were working at that time and tasked to do some things on the short term to cover leads on 9/11 and anything that seemed to be national security related. And I ended up out at Dobbins Air Force Base, which is a suburb of Atlanta. It's in Marietta, Georgia. It's close to where I lived. And basically all the agents who lived in that area got assigned to Dobbins Air Force Base, and we worked with the Air Force OSI. Our job was to make sure that Dobbins was safe and cover any leads that people were calling in about things that made them nervous and so forth. Dobbins is a control base because it's where the F-22 and the F-35 stealth fighters are made, and the Raptor Lockheed has a plant out there. So pretty sensitive base, and we worked with the OSI just to cover leads. On a particular day, OSI talked to one of their sources who told a story about going to church one Sunday morning after 9/11 in uniform on base. This source was an enlisted lady from the Air Force. And she told the OSI agent, that during the church service, she was confronted, if you will, by a person wearing a Marine uniform who was a captain, and that he basically was hitting on her in the middle of church service. And she just knew this to be really weird. He didn't carry himself as a Marine Corps captain, and just his behavior was improper. So she took his phone number, and then she passed that to the OSI agent, who then passed it to us. And we were able to identify the individual Found out he was a convicted felon. Found out that he was currently out on bond from one of the Atlanta area DeKalb County municipalities on a rape charge. So I wrote a search warrant for his apartment under the law that I mentioned earlier about the impersonation of a federal employee, because that's all we had at the time. So I alleged that he was wearing his uniform on this base and claiming to be a Marine Corps officer. Judge signed the warrant. We did the search warrant. And inside his apartment, we found a full display of uniforms, the camis that he wears every day to the service uniform or the dress uniform that he would wear, what the Marines call the blues, the dress blues. He had everything. And he gave it all up. Jerry, he said that he bought all of these at a surplus store, at an Army surplus store, which is perfectly legal. You can buy these things. He bought a little book that told him how to wear his medals and wear his ribbons and so forth, which you and I talked about just a few minutes ago. He could buy all of these medals and he could buy all these ribbons at this Army surplus store because it's free to trade in these. An interesting thing that when we did that search warrant, inside his apartment, we found a little pellet gun that had been hidden. And it just struck us that why would he hide a pellet gun? So we took that as evidence. And we took the uniforms and we took all the things relevant to the impersonation crime. Well, after coordinating with the local municipality that he was on bond for the rape charge, turns out that that pellet gun turned out to be very important because the victim had given a detailed description of a handgun that this man had used to hold to her head during the rape, and it matched this pellet gun. And we happened to find it in that apartment when we did the search. So that gave DeKalb County a little bit more, or a lot more, evidence. And he ultimately pled guilty to the rape, and he pled guilty to our impersonation charge. So he pled guilty over in the state court, and then we brought him over to federal court. Because we ended up finding later that normally when guys are doing these impersonation cases or doing these stolen valor cases, if you dig into their background, they're doing other things illegal as well. I'm sure there are examples of guys who are not, but there's a lot of examples of guys who are. This is just one little facet of their criminal lifestyle that they're leading. And this guy fits the perfect example. And today, I looked him up not too long ago. He's serving a life sentence for child molestation. So just a really bad guy all the way around. He was wearing a uniform and he was getting onto the Air Force base because before 9/11, the guards at the gate would just wave you through if you were in uniform. Kind of a weird, crazy rule as we think about it with our post 9/11 mentality now, but that's how easy it was to get on a base. If you dressed up in a uniform, they'd wave you through.
Wow.
And that's how he was getting on base. All we had to do was prove that he was going to the commissary, to the PX and stuff, and buying things. He wouldn't have to show an ID because he was in uniform. So that met the requirement of the financial benefit of the impersonation. So that was my first introduction to what we now call stolen valor cases, and that was just right after 9/11. That was probably in the winter months of 2001.
I guess I should remember that, as far as ID and being able to get off and on the base, just based on being in uniform. But I didn't remember that from my childhood.
It would vary from base to base and who's on duty, and the rules were kind of lax because, again, it was pre 9/11. Of course, now, you go through these jersey barriers when you go on base. Everybody shows their ID, so on and so on. It has improved 1,000 times over, but that's really how simple it was. And in a lot of ways, we're lucky that we didn't get taken advantage of even more by those kind of soft security rules. Word kind of gets around and in the law enforcement community, and when these type of cases rear their head, people would say, hey, there's a guy over in the bureau that's done something like this, and give him a call and so forth. And so I would get phone calls about cases where people would have suspicions and so forth. And we worked with them to resolve these because a lot of times you couldn't prosecute them during these times, remembering that one, the law had been declared unconstitutional, the Stolen Valor Act, or if there was no hard evidence that they were getting a financial benefit under the impersonation, you just had to figure out a way to try and resolve it and stop it. And so a lot of times just confronting these individuals while doing legitimate law enforcement interviews would put them on notice that they've been made, and they would stop it. Sometimes, the classic examples are I would get a phone call from someone who says, hey, I work out at Gold's Gym, and we have a trainer there who claims that he was a SEAL in the Navy. And I know he's not. I was in the Navy, and I've talked to him enough to know that he's lying and et cetera. What can we do about this? And then we'd either go talk to that individual and say, hey, there's been an allegation that you might be violating the Stolen Valor Act. Can you tell us this and this? And of course they'd pucker up real fast and either deny it or admit it, but the activity would stop. And so those type of things happen, seems like, almost monthly, unfortunately, because as you know, after 9/11, then the wars kicked off in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so now this was a forefront in the American media, and true legitimate heroes were coming home. And for some reason, some people, people are so insecure, they want to be part of that group of people. And so this just became something that became more and more prevalent. You had to figure out a way to stop it. And it didn't always end in a case or a prosecution. I can give you an example, Jerry, of how it bleeds over into just regular criminal cases. I left Atlanta and moved up to an RA in North Georgia in 2007. So I spent my last 10 years in an RA up in North Georgia, and I was on Safe Streets Task Force up there, and myself and the agents there and the task force worked a outlaw motorcycle case. And of course, as you probably know from your own experience and from the way media projects, there's a lot of veterans in motorcycle clubs and so forth. And that's either legitimate or illegitimate clubs. And the Outlaws were no exception. There were a handful of guys that claimed to be veterans. And I was up on a wire so I could hear these guys talking about their service. To step back and inform you and the audience, there's the National Archives in St. Louis that is called the National Personnel Records Center, and it's just simply referred to as the Archives. And there at the Archives, there's military personnel records that are available to the public under the Freedom of Information Act. But they're also available to the FBI if you have an open case. The Bureau actually has an employee at this St. Louis Archives that has a Bureau email, Bureau phone number, and you can contact that person. And you can say, as an agent, and say, I'm working this case, give them a case number, and so is a defendant in my case or a subject in my case, and I want to look at his military records because it's relevant to the case. And they will send you an unofficial copy of his military records via email, almost within 24 hours. And you can look at these records and determine if this guy is lying or not that's in your case. And then if you decide you need an official copy for trial purposes, they'll print you one, send it to you with a seal on it too, that's suitable for being introduced as an exhibit at trial. So that St. Louis connection is very, very important to the Bureau guys that are working these cases. So I take you back to this outlaw motorcycle case, and one of our defendants, who had been an outlaw since the mid-'70s, he was of the Vietnam generation, and he went to trial. It was on a drug charge. And having listened to his phone calls and of the like, I knew that he had served in the Marines in some capacity, so I pulled his military records. And he did serve in the Marines. That is correct. But what he failed to tell everybody else is that he had been given a bad conduct discharge for going AWOL when his unit got assigned to Vietnam. So in other words, when it was time to go to combat, he said, I'm not doing it, and he left.
Wow. That is even more egregious than somebody just saying that they were in the military and they weren't. Somebody who actually was called to serve and then bailed.
Yeah, and he was actually charged with AWOL, which we use that term a lot in society, but not often does a person get charged with absent without leave, which is commonly referred to as AWOL. And if you're gone from your military duties for more than 30 days, you're declared AWOL. And then there's a warrant that goes out for your arrest. The Bureau had worked AWOL cases during the Vietnam era for years. Agents would get AWOL leads and track these guys down that were literally deserters, for lack of a better term, but their charge was AWOL, absent without leave. And this particular individual had been charged with AWOL and convicted and went to the brig. But somehow in his plea, the Marine Corps decided that they would allow him to come back into the Marine Corps and continue to serve. And then if he served honorably, he'd been given a bad conduct discharge, they would reduce his bad conduct discharge to an other than honorable. which would allow him to have certain benefits. And he took that plea, and he stayed on active duty after he got out of the brig. And then his unit did get shipped out, but his unit was on a particular ship, and it never went ashore in Vietnam. And what happened a lot in Vietnam, Jerry, was that these Navy ships that were patrolling somewhere in the area of Vietnam, if they went across a certain imaginary line into Vietnam waters, they were legally and technically inside a combat zone. And the members of that ship warranted and rated a campaign medal, because if you're only there for 24 hours, you rate a Vietnam campaign medal. Even if you're in the waters and you can't even see the shore, technically, you still rate the campaign medal, saying that I served in Vietnam, meaning in the country itself. And this particular member of the Outlaws was on a ship that did one 24-hour pass-through, because it's very detailed in his military records. And so therefore, he earned the Vietnam campaign medal. And that was legitimate. But what he did not legitimately do was go ashore and serve beyond that 24 hours on a ship. So when he took the stand at his own trial, we were prepared for him, myself and the prosecutor, an AUSA by the name of Bill McKinnon. And we had prepped for this. This particular individual had been involved in a shooting in the Atlanta area in the mid-'70s, and he went to trial and was acquitted. But because he took the stand, we could ask him about it. We can go over his entire criminal history. And we basically baited him. And when we asked him about that shooting, he said, yeah, I did that shooting. I defended myself just as I learned how to do in Vietnam. And when he said that, of course, opened the door, as prosecutors like to say, to talk about his Vietnam service. And then we were able to introduce all of his statements that he had made on the T3s and et cetera, where he claimed to have been served in combat and done all these great things. And what it did was it just showed the jury that this man was a liar and you shouldn't believe his testimony. He got so upset at the government and so upset at the prosecutor when he basically, tied him up in knots on the stand, that he turned his back to the prosecutor and refused to answer any more questions until the judge told him that he was going to lock him up if he didn't start answering the questions and turn back around and face the jury. So it was just a great moment for the government to take this guy's lies about his Vietnam service and use them against him and help win a case.
Now, you mentioned the word T3, so I do want to make sure that the people listening understand the techniques, methods that you use to gather evidence for this case.
Sure. T3 is just simply short for Title III, which is the authority that government employees have, specifically law enforcement, to be able, with a warrant approved by a judge, to listen to phone calls and record those as it relates to the case that they're investigating. So we recorded that this particular member of the Outlaw Motorcycle Club's phone calls as he was talking to our informant, and we were able to use those against him.
Now, in this particular case, what was the financial gain that he got from lying about his Vietnam service?
Well, there was no gain, so we never charged him with this. Remember, this was a drug case, and he was on trial for being involved in a drug conspiracy, and he took the stand to try and defend himself. He basically wanted to claim he didn't know that the drug conspiracy was going on. But because he brought in his military record in an effort to defend himself, we were able to cross him on that. So this was an example of us being able to not prosecute someone under stolen valor, but to use the spirit of the stolen valor to prove to the jury that he was lying. The jury was only out a couple hours and came back with a guilty verdict on the drug charges. So he was never charged for that violation, and there was no financial benefit. It was just him trying to boost his ego within the motorcycle world.
And so you used his lies to impeach his testimony on the stand.
Absolutely. And we specifically wanted as many veterans on the jury as we could get, and we had a couple. You can read a jury by just looking at their eyes sometimes when you've made a point. And we were pretty confident that they got it, that this guy, anything he says from this point on, you can't trust him, because obviously if he's lying about his service in Vietnam, what else is he lying about? And it worked well for us in that case. That was in I think we went to trial on that case in around 2014. 2015, the next year, I mentioned to you a little earlier that Tiffany Baker in Columbia had a case that had a strong Atlanta connection. She reached out to me and said she needed me to help cover a lead. And of course, the case that you and I are going to talk about today, the Shane Ladner case, was ongoing as well, and she knew about that. And so she called, we just kind of compared cases. You may remember, Jerry, that in July of 2015, in Chattanooga, Tennessee, at a military recruiting station, a Muslim male who had been radicalized online did a drive-by shooting of that recruiting station. And he killed 3 Marines active duty and 1 sailor active duty, plus a 4th by an individual named Skip Wells that we're going to talk about. So there were 5 servicemen that were killed that day. And then the police responded and they killed the bad guy. And so it was a bad day in that July 2015. It made a lot of news nationwide, but Chattanooga being close to Atlanta, it made a lot of news here as well. And Skip Wells was a young Lance Corporal in the Marine Corps who had just graduated from boot camp. And he was doing a 30 or 60 day temporary service at this recruiting station in between boot camp and waiting for his next schooling, what we call the MOS, military occupation schooling, had not started yet. So the Marine Corps will send these young Marines to recruiting stations to help out while they're waiting for school. And he was there when this shooting happened, and he was a victim, and he died that day. His mother lived in Atlanta. She lived in the same neighborhood where this Marietta Dobbins Air Force Base was located, and so she lived in my community where I used to live. And Tiffany asked me to go and locate her and interview her, because what Tiffany had found out is that there had been a Marine in the Columbia Division, specifically down in Hilton Head. Tiffany was in the Hilton Head RA. There had been a former Marine down there and had a charity that she was investigating because she felt like he was committing fraud through this charity. This particular individual, his name's John Simpson, and he's now in prison. He claimed to be a retired Marine Master Sergeant, and of course, he claimed to be Force Recon. All the Navy guys that are imposters claim to be SEALs. All the Marine imposters claim to be Force Recon, and all the Army imposters claim to be Delta or Green Berets. They always want to go for the special operations community. And this particular Marine former Marine operated a charity called Marines for Mickey, as in Mickey Mouse. And the pretense was that he was going to take charitable donations and send combat veterans and their families to all expenses paid trips to Disney World when they came back from Afghanistan or Iraq and they had been wounded. Specifically, he wanted to target wounded individuals to help their family heal and send them on this vacation. So he took donations from around the country. Well, he made a personal trip out to Atlanta to interview Skip Wells' mother. Her name's Kathy. And he solicited money from Kathy because either he figured it out himself or somehow he learned that Kathy had been receiving a lot of donations. People were just outpouring their sympathy by making charitable donations to her in honor of her son, Skip, who had died up in Chattanooga. And she had collected over $200,000 in these donations. And she didn't want the money. It was in honor of her dead son, and she was looking for a place to donate it, and et cetera. And here came this guy claiming to be from Marines for Mickey and claimed to be this retired Marine Master Sergeant, and et cetera. And she donated over $200,000 to his charity. And in reality, John Simpson had been given a bad conduct discharge from the Marine Corps. He had been reduced in rank to a private and discharged. He too had went AWOL. And his MOS while he was in the Marines was he's a financial clerk. So that's who he really was, not who he was portraying himself to be. And Tiffany had figured this out and asked me to go and interview his mother. And she said, yeah. He came and he sat down with me and gave me this great story about Marines for Mickey. And I donated, in total, it was about $250,000 that she donated to his charity. Tiffany found other victims like this, but none at that dollar amount.
How did the mother of Skip Wells, she must have been devastated that something that she was doing in the memory of her son was violated and used for, simply a financial fraud, financial gain.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a hard interview for me to do, to say the least. I met with her probably 3 times. We met at the same coffee shop every time, and she wanted to sit outside under, at the table and under the umbrella because she knew she was going to cry, because it was just such an emotional thing for one to talk about her son, and then two, realize that all of these nice people's efforts and benefits and donations had gone to this. She felt like she had let them down in a lot of ways by allowing herself to be the victim of this fraud. So yeah, she was devastated. Ultimately, Simpson pled guilty, but she made a great witness at his sentencing. She came and told her story, and the judge sentenced him to 4 years in prison as he pled guilty to wire fraud. So that's an example of what I was mentioning to you earlier, that the United States Attorney's Office decided not to go with the Stolen Valor Act because it's a misdemeanor now, and instead decided to go with just a simple wire fraud and to meet the elements. He's now locked up as of 2019, and that was a great case that the Columbia Division made. And these are just going on around the country, unfortunately. And these are just a couple that I wanted to kind of set the tone for before we talked about Shane Ladner.
Well, I can see how these are important cases. Even if the actual Stolen Valor Act is not charged.
Sometimes these are called statement cases. I have a good prosecutor friend who realized that sometimes the U.S. Attorney's Office needs to take a case just because it makes a statement. Maybe there's not a lot of loss there financially. Maybe it's not going to send somebody to prison for a long period of time. Maybe you do go after the misdemeanor if that's all you've got, but it needs to be done because it's a statement case to the community, to saying that this is important and we're going to prosecute it. About this time, Jerry, in 2014-ish, I live in a small community in North Georgia, and I'm friends with my local state representative here. And he and I were talking one time, and I asked him, how come the state of Georgia did not have a Stolen Valor Act? Because states were starting to come on board as well and create their own stolen valor laws. At that time, I think there were 10 to 12 states of the 50 that had Stolen Valor Acts. And Terry Rogers, my state representative and a good friend to this day, said to me, well, if you'll help me draft it and point me in the right direction, I'll sponsor it and we'll see what we can do. And so, long story short, over a 2-year period, Terry was finally able to get it introduced here in the state of Georgia at the Capitol down in Atlanta. It passed overwhelmingly, and the governor signed it, and I was invited down for the signing of that. And so that was a great time for Georgia. But unfortunately, when Terry called to tell me that it had been approved and signed, and the governor was going to sign it as well, he caveated it by saying that it's a misdemeanor. And the justification for that was simply that if the federal law is going to be a misdemeanor, then the states were going to make it a misdemeanor as well. So there is a law on the books here in the state of Georgia now, but unfortunately it's kind of a nerf hammer as well. But it does give law enforcement their foot in the door to conduct these investigations and see where it takes us. And then maybe we leapfrog to a better charge. So because there is laws on the books now in various states to include Georgia, law enforcement can now use these as their foot in the door for these investigations. And that's how we, the FBI, got our foot in the door with the Shane Ladner case. This case actually starts, Jerry, if you look at it on the timeline, it starts in 1991 when Shane Ladner enlisted in the Army. And it ended with his sentencing and his jury conviction in 2017. So it was 16 years in the making, and it was all of his making, if you will. But to give you a little bit of a background, Shane Ladner is a resident of Atlanta area and went with boot camp in the Army in 1991 and was assigned the MOS of an MP, a military police. And right after boot camp and right after MP school, he was assigned down to as a private first class, an E2 in the enlisted ranks, which is second from the bottom, very junior person. He was assigned to a base down in Honduras, the Sotocano Air Base, which is where Joint Task Force Bravo was located also. And Joint Task Force Bravo was kind of famous because they were really the place where the counter-drug interdiction operations were being operated for that part of the world out of that base as well. And Shane Ladner was assigned to this base in a very simple capacity as actually I correct myself. My notes say he was a private. He was still in E1 at this time, so he was very junior and very green. And he's assigned as a military policeman to guard the SCIF, which is there located on the base. SCIF is an acronym, SCIF, for Sensitive Compartment and Information Facility. And it's just a secure building that generally, in the military, it's a building that is brick with no windows and wrapped in concertina wire to keep the bad guys out, where you handle and listen and process classified information. And it's the most sensitive of all classified information, so it has its own handling facility, which we refer to as a SCIF, Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility. And when I was in the Marine Corps, Jerry, I had been an intelligence officer, and I had worked in and around SCIFs as well, so I was very familiar with how the military operated SCIFs. I was in the Marines at the same time that Shane Ladner was serving as a SCIF guard down in Honduras. And what Shane's job was down there, very simply, he was a screener at the front door, because there's only one door in and one door out of a SCIF. Remember, this was 1991, so thumb drives didn't exist, and really digital media didn't exist. Classified information was in the paper form. And so SCIF guards would simply go through your bags as you were leaving the facility every day to make sure you were not taking any classified documents out of the facility. It's an important job, but it's really that simple. And that was his job for 1 year while he was there. And then he leaves Honduras, and then he got assigned to Fort Polk, Louisiana, and then on to Fort Hood, Texas. And then in 1994, he applied for an early discharge under the hardship clause because his grandmother was dying, and he was, at that time, he claimed that he was the only living relative and he needed to go and care for her. So the Army let him out a little bit early of his 4-year enlistment. And so he was given a DD-214, and he was discharged. And a DD-214, which is what every serviceman gets, and these are kept on archives records in St. Louis. It goes in your service record book along with your medical records and your any other records that the government wants to keep. It tells where you served, what schools you went to, what awards you were given, and what the nature of your discharge was, whether it was honorable, other than honorable. A DD-214 is an extremely simple document to read. Shane, when he got discharged from the Army, his records go to St. Louis, and he's given a DD-214, and it's kept on record there. Because it would become important later, I'll go ahead and jump ahead and say that his DD-214 had nothing on it that was suspicious from his service as a military police for 3.5 years in the Army. There was no Purple Heart. There was no Medals of Valor. It was simply service medals for the appropriate time and an honorable discharge, which is what 99.9% of the troops during that generation, what their DD-214s would look like as well. So nothing that raised any red flags from that point. Shane comes back ultimately to the Atlanta area, and he kind of bounces around with jobs. I remember one of his jobs where he was worked as a pest exterminator in a company and had been there for a couple of years. And then eventually he moved his way into corrections and became a jailer at various Metro County jails. And probably for financial reasons, in the late 90s, so some 5 years later after he had left the Army, he re-enlists in the Army National Guard. And he's assigned as an MP, and he drills with a reserve unit here in the Atlanta metro area. It's a 4-year enlistment, and then 9/11 happens. So about 2 years into this Army National Guard enlistment, 9/11 happened, and his Army National Guard unit is activated. So he's discharged from the National Guard, technically, given another discharge document, not a DD-214, but those are called NGB-22s. And we examined that one later during his investigation, and there was nothing suspicious on that. He serves 1 year of active duty with his unit at Camp Merrill, located in Dahlonega, as a military policeman working the front gate. Camp Merrill is where the Rangers conduct some of their training during their mountain warfare phase, so it's kind of a famous base in the Army. After his 1 year is up, his unit gets reassigned back to National Guard status. He's given another DD-214 because he's left active duty again. And this is now his second DD-214, and there's nothing suspicious on that as well. It looks very similar to the first one, plus the updates from his 1 year of service in the 2001-2002 era. At this point, he has two DD-214s, and none of them are suspicious. He has an NGB-22. He has one of those from the National Guard, and they're all in archives, all in St. Louis, and none of them mention a Purple Heart. Well, his unit gets activated a second time a couple years later from National Guard status back to active duty again. Now it's 2004. This time he serves down at Fort Benning as a game warden, kind of under that military police umbrella, if you will. Well, he decides that he's hurt and he wants to get a medical discharge. So in 2005, the Army discharges him. But he's still on active duty at this time. His unit's been activated. So he's getting out of the service completely, so he does full medical screenings. He claimed he had a bad back from stepping off of a curb and hurt his back while he was in Camp Dahlonega, and the Army gives him 50% disability for his bad back. He also claims at this time to have PTSD. The Army denied him PTSD because there was no findings of combat service in his record book, and he didn't appeal that. He's medically discharged, and now he's out for good. So he gets a third and final DD-214. Now, this DD-214 that he got in 2005 could not be found in archives in St. Louis when this became a case of interest. Nobody knows where his final DD-214 ended up, and so we don't know why there wasn't one there. But he had a copy of his third and final DD-214. And later, as we went to trial, he would claim, well, thank God I've got my copy because the Army has lost my official archives copy. He's the only person on the planet with this third and final copy of his DD-214. And he produced this when he was finally arrested for the Stolen Valor charge. But wouldn't you know that this third and final DD-214 listed a Purple Heart. And it also listed a number of other medals of valor that he would not have been in any campaigns to earn them. And some of them were medals that are awarded to officers of senior rank, and he was a junior enlisted man, so he would have never been awarded this medal. Now this third and final DD-214 is very, very suspicious. It wouldn't have become an issue until he became arrested and law enforcement wanted to look at this DD-214. So in between 2005 and 2012, Shane becomes a police officer. He left the jailer corrections occupation and became a police officer in a small community called Holly Springs, Georgia, which is also north of Atlanta. And he used this third and final DD-214 to walk into the license plate bureau each year and get a Purple Heart license plate. And the benefit for him to do that is that in the state of Georgia, you're taxed on the value of your vehicle when you go to renew your plate and your tag every year. So the more expensive your vehicle, the more expensive the taxes that you're going to pay. If you are awarded a Purple Heart license plate, then you're exempt from those taxes. So each year that he claimed, which was about 6 years, he claimed to have a Purple Heart, he defrauded the state of Georgia out of approximately between $500 and $1,000 each of those years, which we would later come to know it meets felony status for the state of Georgia for financial fraud. Up until 2012, he's driving around with a Purple Heart license plate. And people see his plate, and specifically his family members see these plates, specifically the family members of his wife. Her name is Meg, stands for Megan, and his in-laws do not like him. And they see that he's driving around with this license plate, and they also tell us later about the stories that he would tell them when he was in their audience that he served in Somalia, that he was in the movie Black Hawk Down, his character, for example. And they just knew from common sense that there's no way that he was in Somalia as an MP, military policeman. They told us stories that they would come and pick him up from the airport when they were flying on vacation, and that he would put a red veteran's hat on his head, take a cane out of the trunk of his car, and start walking with a limp so that he can move to the front of the line and not have to wait for baggage or wait for ticketing and things of that nature. And when his in-laws would confront his wife, Meg, and say something to the effect, what is your husband doing? She would simply say, oh, that's just Shane being Shane. And so she would excuse this type of behavior. And so this was kind of going on throughout their marriage, which, as I recall, was about the time he became a police officer in 2005. So for about a 5 to 7 year period, his in-laws are just getting crazy suspicious that he's just this big fraudster. What ultimately led to his downfall, Jerry, was that in 2012, he submitted an application for a veterans parade called the Show of Support Hunt for Heroes, which was held in Midland, Texas. In that application, which was self-submitted to be in this parade and be on this parade float and go on this paid-for hunt in Midland, Texas, he submitted an application stating that he had been wounded and earned a Purple Heart during the Panama invasion of 1989. He gets accepted, and he goes to Midland, and he goes on this guided hunt, and he gets awarded a rifle, and they have a ceremony in a ballroom, which is black tie and dinner, and they call these guys up on stage, and they tell about the great things that they've done, and they award them these rifles and all this other gear, and they pay for their airfare, and they pay for their hotels, and all of this show of support is funded by contributions from citizens who want to support their veterans. We would eventually find out that all of the airfare, room, meals, rifles, ammo, hunting gear, you name it, was about $20,000 in loss. The people that make the decision who are going to be in the parade, who are going to be chosen, is a board of directors. And one of those board of director members was a retired Marine, Major General, 2 stars. And I won't say his name for embarrassment reasons. He's a Marine 2-star general. Jerry, this is the most amazing of coincidences that you may have, at least I think you may have ever heard in all your podcasts. My last year in the Marine Corps, I was an aide for a 2-star general. This same exact Marine 2-star general.
Wow.
And this was in Hawaii. And we remained in contact. In fact, he had came and visited me in North Georgia when he was in the area for a funeral of one of his Vietnam friends. We went to church together and we had lunch together. We stayed in contact. I had his number in my cell phone. He's on the board of directors, and he's part of the selection process that brings Shane on as one of the selected members to go on this guided hunt. Well, in November of 2012, which is during Veterans Day, they have a parade. And what this parade looks like, Jerry, is basically you take a giant flatbed trailer, you put a large white tablecloth over the top of it and dress it up a little bit. Then you put chairs on top of this flatbed trailer, and then you pull this flatbed trailer through town with a vehicle. In this case, it was a semi-truck. That's how big the flatbed trailer was. And you sit on this flatbed trailer along with your wife, and you wave to the people in town as you go through town, and they're waving at you and saying, "Thank you for your service." Shane was on this flatbed trailer along with his wife and along with some legitimate real-world heroes. There was 2 sergeant majors from the Army that one had received a Silver Star and served in Delta Force. One had received 3 Bronze Stars and been a Green Beret. Another had 2 Purple Hearts from the Army, and he was a sergeant, and he had been medically discharged for his injuries from an IED. And the 4th was a Chief Warrant Officer from the Marine Corps who had been medically discharged from an IED as well from brain trauma. Well, as this parade float is driving through Midland, Texas, they cross over a railroad track. And when they cross over this railroad track, because it's so long, they get stuck at a red light that's on the other side of the railroad track. And the flatbed trailer is now on the train track stuck until the light turns red. And wouldn't you know, a train is coming.
No.
And a train hits this flatbed trailer and kills these 4 soldiers and Marines that I just told you about. 17 people are injured in total, including Shane's wife. She loses her left leg. This makes national news. Train hits veterans parade float. Just a terrible, terrible accident. Well, at this point, Shane's family says, "You know what? Enough's enough. We knew this guy was lying about his military service, and now he's going to get our niece killed. He's going to get our aunt killed." Whatever relation Meg was to them, her family really came out and said, "Enough's enough." Shane and his wife are flown back to Atlanta as heroes, and the city of Atlanta rallies around them. Their community rallies around them, rallies around Meg. The in-laws at the same time are writing letters. They write a letter to the FBI. They write a letter to the Cherokee County Sheriff's Office, Cherokee County, which is where Shane lived. And they write a letter to Randy Travis, which is a Fox News investigative reporter for Atlanta. And the only people they hear back from is the Fox News reporter. What I later learned is the letter they wrote to the FBI went into a 1A and went into some abandoned complaint file, and I never saw it. We eventually found the letter when I went to look for it, but somebody had put it in a 1A and put it out of sight, out of mind. So they just assumed the Bureau had no interest in this case. Cherokee County Sheriff's Office conducted a little bit of an investigation in the beginning, but Fox News ran with it. And Randy Travis started doing his own investigation that maybe this hero was not really a hero after all. And he did what I mentioned to you earlier, Jerry. He went through the Freedom of Information Act back to St. Louis, and he pulled Shane Ladner's military records. And he found those DD-214s that I'd mentioned to you earlier, where none of them reveal a Purple Heart. Of course, this final and third DD-214 was not in his record at all. So there was no evidence of a Purple Heart. In fact, Randy Travis found out, Shane Ladner had been in high school in 1989, which is the year that he claimed to have been injured in the Panama invasion. So Randy Travis ran these news videos on the 6 o'clock news, the 10 o'clock news in the Atlanta metro area, telling the city of Atlanta what he had found out. Shane Ladner might be a perpetrator of stolen valor. Well, Ladner immediately lawyers up, and in fact, he sues Fox 5. And then he changes his story through his lawyer and says that he was actually wounded on a classified mission in Honduras, serving at Joint Task Force Bravo in San Antonio, Honduras. That when he was injured there, he was taken to a military hospital in Panama. He woke up from a coma with a Purple Heart attached to his pillow. Later, he was visited by an Army colonel who told him to say nothing about the classified mission that he had been on, and instead to say that he had been wounded in Panama if he was ever asked. Now remember, Ladner is an E1 private military police MOS at this time. And that's the story his lawyer tells Randy Travis and Fox News. As I said, Ladner sues Fox 5. That case progresses through the civil courts. A video deposition occurs, and Ladner is deposed, and he testifies to his actions in Honduras. And we would later be able to get a copy of that and use it at his trial in the state court. So it turned out to be a great piece of evidence for the government to use his own words to show how he describes what his actions were as an MP, E1 private out in the jungles, basically playing Rambo. Jerry is what he was claiming that he was doing, that he was attacking enemy machine gun nests, saving lives. Meanwhile, Cherokee County Sheriff's Office is also conducting an investigation. They're getting a little pressure because Fox News is broadcasting these things on the news and saying that Shane Ladner, a resident of their county and a police officer in their county, is actually a perpetrator of stolen valor. So they pull his records. They pull Shane Ladner's records from archives as well, Cherokee County does. And they do not find a DD-214 to support a Purple Heart as well. So they arrest Shane Ladner. And they charge him with some fraud, and they charge him, of course, we don't have the state stolen valor law on the books yet. So they charge him with the frauds to the county for the Purple Heart license plate. Well, at this time, Ladner finally produces this third and final DD-214 that does show the Purple Heart. He gives that to his attorney, who gives that to the Cherokee County Sheriff's Office. And now Cherokee County is confronted with this DD-214 that says he has a Purple Heart. There's no other copies of this. It's not in his military archives. It's not in St. Louis. He has the only copy in the world. And again, his response is, thank goodness I have my copy because the Army lost all the others. So Cherokee County is kind of in a spot where do we go from here? How do we prove that this DD-214 is a fraud? I mentioned to you earlier, I was on the Safe Streets Task Force, Jerry, and we had 2 officers on that task force with us. They did not know him personally. No, he was a officer in a small municipality, Holly Springs. They certainly were familiar with Holly Springs, but they just didn't know all the officers in Holly Springs because they were sheriff's deputies. But one thing leads to another, and the DA's office puts the word out that, we're looking for some help on this case. These Cherokee County Sheriff's Office deputies mention my name to them, and they reach out and say, hey, can you come over? We'd like to talk to you about this case. And so myself and this same prosecutor that I'd mentioned earlier to you, Bill McKinnon, this AUSA that I was working with exclusively, we went over and we met with the Cherokee County law enforcement officials, and specifically we met with the Blue Ridge Judicial Circuit District Attorney, which was responsible for prosecuting the case. And I remember, Jerry, the first time I walked in and meet with them, great folks, friends with them even to today. And we sat around a big conference table and they kind of summarized the case to me. And they showed me the DD-214. And I look at the DD-214 and in about 60 seconds, I could tell them with a lot of confidence this is a fraud. I'm not an expert, but I can tell you this is a fraud. And they say, we believe it's a fraud too, but we've got a problem. The DA is Shannon Wallace, a wonderful lady who's still the chief prosecutor over there, tough-nosed. She has her lead prosecutor, Rochelle Carnicel, there with them. Both ladies are tough prosecutors who, work murders and crimes against children. So they want to prosecute this guy, but they're not sure how they're going to do it. And they tell me, here's the problem. They claim they have a Marine two-star general who will testify in his defense that when he was in Vietnam, Purple Hearts were, in fact, attached to people's pillows. And that is not an uncommon way to give a Purple Heart. And I said, really? Who is this Marine two-star general?
Let me
and
guess.
They slid over a printed out bio of the general. And I said to them, Jerry, I said, that's interesting. Would you like me to call this general? And they looked at me like, okay, what's the joke here? Because right, that's a pretty crazy thing to say. Would you like me to call this general that you just showed me a picture of? And I said, I served with this general. I served for this general. I have him in my phone. I'll call him right now. And they like, yeah, call him. So I called the general and I put him on speakerphone and he picked up. And I said, General, it's Mark, and what's going on? And here's what I'm doing. And I'm investigating the Shane Ladner thing. And he said, yeah, I know it's a terrible thing. All these veterans got hurt and it's just a terrible, terrible thing. I said, General, we believe Shane Ladner is a fraud, that he never earned this Purple Heart. He should have never been on that parade float. And his wife lost her leg because of his lies. And he said, Mark, I have to tell you, when I was in Vietnam, I saw these type of things happen where Purple Hearts were pinned to pillows. And I said, I understand that, General, but every one of those Purple Hearts has supporting documentation. There were hundreds of thousands of Purple Hearts issued, hundreds of thousands in Vietnam. There's paperwork to back this up, and there's witnesses to the service member getting injured. There's background here. There's supporting evidence. There's documentation. There's humans that can back this up. You have this one person, Shane Ladner, who has nobody to support this, because when he was interviewed by Cherokee County upon his initial arrest, they asked him, can you give us one name of one person who will support your story? And he couldn't do it. Just tell us the guy serving next to you and we'll call him, he'll verify it, and we'll drop this case. And he couldn't do it. He could never give any supporting documentation other than this one DD-214 that he had a copy of. So I had this conversation with the general. I said, General, I just have to politely disagree with you. I think this guy has pulled the wool over show of support and hunt for heroes, and I think you guys have been a victim of his stolen valor. And the general really didn't want to agree with me. We had some friendly debates. We talked one more time over the phone after I told him some more evidence that we were uncovering. And he never wanted to agree with me. But once that got relayed over to the defense, that I knew the general who was going to be their star witness, it took the wind out of their sails, I'm pretty sure. Ultimately, when we went to trial against Shane Ladner, the general did not testify. So you can draw your own conclusions from that, but he ultimately did not testify. At the same time, the agreement was made that the U.S. Attorney's Office would open a grand jury investigation, and we would use the power of subpoena to pull records from this veterans organization and any place else we needed to. And that once the investigation that I conducted was complete, then we would compare the U.S. Attorney's Office investigation to the Blue Ridge, Cherokee County investigation, and we would decide how we wanted to prosecute this case. Jerry, as you probably know from your career, one of the things that agents love to complain about is the U.S. Attorney's Office. In my 20 years, I never had a bad experience really with the U.S. Attorney's Office. I took cases to them and they prosecuted it. Maybe I was just lucky, but I always had great experiences with the U.S. Attorney's Office. I worked organized crime and I worked safe streets, and we always had great experiences. But ultimately, what came of this was the U.S. Attorney's Office said, we're not going to prosecute this case. It's probably the one time that I was most disappointed.
And why?
Well, the $20,000, which was the financial fraud that I was able to prove, that Shane Ladner had gotten from Hunt from Heroes would have only been a probated sentence on the guidelines. So the U.S. Attorney's Office, if they wanted to charge him with stolen valor, it would have been a misdemeanor. If they wanted to charge him with a financial fraud, the loss of $20,000 would have only been a probated sentence. So to them, it was not worth the time and effort for a probated sentence. So they kicked it over to the locals. They kicked it to the Blue Ridge and to the Cherokee County. And I made an agreement with them that I would do anything and everything I can that my chain of command in the FBI will allow me to do to support your case. Dave DeValle was my new SAC. Dave recently passed away as a 9/11 victim, but Dave served in the Marines. And from the SAC down through my supervisor, who was also a Marine, they said, go for it. Support this case as much and as hard as you can. So I, along with the Safe Streets Task Force and the manpower that went with them, we started knocking on doors. We went and did all the interviews we possibly could do. And what we were really able to do, Jerry, that made this case, I think, a success at the end of the day, is that one of the police officers was on my Safe Streets Task Force. His name is Joe Amerling. And Joe was a Gainesville police officer, which is up in the North Georgia area. Joe had retired from the Army as a first sergeant, had been a ranger, and had been assigned to Camp Merrill, coincidentally, which is the same place that Shane Ladner had spent 1 year. So me being a Marine veteran, Joe being an Army veteran who can speak Army and I can speak Marine, we pulled Shane's records and we looked at all of his orders and all the people that he served with, which were listed on his orders. And Social Security numbers, thankfully, were also in these military records for all of these people that he served with. So we were able, through lots and lots and days of digging and digging, to find people that served with Shane, to include his entire chain of command down in Honduras. We found his commanding officer, who coincidentally also retired eventually as a 2-star general and lived in the Atlanta area. We found his executive officer. We found his company commander. We even found one of the privates that slept next to him in the same barracks. We found the medical commanding officer who would have treated any medical emergency, such as a gunshot wound. We found the executive officer. In military speak, we found his entire chain of command. And
Wow.
We interviewed them over the telephone. And every one of those people, without a hesitation, said, no, it didn't happen. Hell no, it didn't happen the way Shane Ladner is claiming that it happened. No one during that time frame was ever injured in a secret combat mission, certainly not an E1, certainly not a military policeman, certainly not a skiff guard. To include the guy that slept next to him every night in the next bunk, he told the jury exactly what their duties were every day. Closest they ever came to Rambo was the VCR tape they might have watched at the end of the duty. So when we went to trial, we produced all of these witnesses that Joe and I were able to find and were able to interview and come in and tell what happened. These were Vietnam era generation officers, and they had earned Purple Hearts some of these officers while they were in Vietnam. So not only did they take the stand and testify that, no, this never happened, and yes, I am a Purple Heart recipient, and I know what the process is to be awarded a Purple Heart, and we educated the jury. And that's where I'd like to go next with this jury, is to tell the audience how it is that you earn a Purple Heart legally in the military. It's really simple. There's 2 ways that you can earn a Purple Heart. The first way is the simplest way. The Secretary of Defense declares an area a combat zone, whether it be the Vietnam that I mentioned to you earlier, the Vietnam waters, whether it be Iraq, Afghanistan. There's a geographical area. There's lines in the sand that are drawn and says this is a combat zone. If you get injured by the enemy, you are awarded a Purple Heart. It's really that simple. Now, let me ask you this, Jerry. If I may, let me quiz you.
Okay.
So the movie Captain Phillips.
Yes, I watched it.
If we're talking about the right one, it's the movie where he's the captain of the oil tanker that's out in the Somali Gulf.
Yes, and kidnapped by Somali pirates.
It gets kidnapped by Somali pirates, right. Well, at the end of the day, the Navy SEALs do a ninja mission and they come and they rescue him, right?
Yeah.
A gunfight happens, a Navy SEAL gets wounded. Does that Navy SEAL get awarded a Purple Heart? Because I can tell you right now, those Somali waters are not a combat zone.
I would say yes, but I guess you're going to tell me no.
No, he does get a Purple Heart because that's the second way you can be awarded a Purple Heart. It is a special citation by the Service Secretary. As you know, there's a Secretary of Defense, and then underneath the Secretary of Defense, there's a Secretary of the Army, of the Navy, and the Air Force. And those are civilians that are put into those places by our Constitution, and they have their office. The Service Secretary has the authority to award Purple Hearts in the exact same scenario, for example, that I just mentioned with Captain Phillips off the Somali coast. So these service secretaries keep track of these special citations over the years that they have awarded and allowed people to have Purple Hearts. I located the lady that runs the historian office and the records office for the Secretary of the Army. She has a database that goes back to Korea, to the 1950s, that will list everybody that the Secretary of the Army has awarded a Purple Heart to through a special citation. She has them cross-referenced by generation, by year, and by name, and by territory. She came and testified at trial that no one by the name of Ladner had ever been awarded a Purple Heart by the Secretary of the Army. No one in Honduras had ever been awarded a Purple Heart by the Secretary of the Army. And no one during those years that are being disputed, 1991, 1992, was ever awarded a Purple Heart by the Secretary of the Army.
So this is like a cross-check of the missing DD-214.
Yes. So now we have the entire chain of command that takes the stand and says, no, it never happened. And now we have a civilian lady that runs the Secretary of the Army's records office, and she says, no, it never happened. And they tell the jury this. And needless to say, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Shane was convicted on, I think, 5 of the 6 counts of the fraud. There was a technicality that he acquitted on one of the other counts. At the end of the day, it was a win for the government. Let me just back up, if I could, and just say that during the trial, it was 2 weeks. It happened in May of 2017. Lots of veterans in attendance. The government called about 12 witnesses, mostly from the chain of command that I mentioned to you earlier. The defense called 2 witnesses. They called a fellow soldier from his National Guard unit who served as a character witness, but no one that had ever served with him during the time of dispute. And they called his wife as a character witness. Of course, she's without a leg, so she comes up to the witness stand in a wheelchair. So you see the great sympathy that the defense is trying to play here for the jury. But it didn't work. The jury convicted. I was not there for sentencing. I'm getting ready to retire, and one of the last things I wanted to do was serve as a new agent counselor at Quantico. So I leave the last half of 2017, and I go to Quantico while sentencing occurs. Shane Ladner is given 10 years probation. One of the obstacles we had in this trial was the judge didn't like the case. He was not a veteran. He didn't see the crime. He didn't see the importance. He routinely postponed this case because the arrest was in 2013 and we didn't go to trial till 2017. So there was 4 years of delays and postponements. But regardless, he ended up giving him 10 years probation. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we didn't care if Shane served 1 day in jail. What we wanted to do was to prove to the world that Shane Ladner was a liar, that Shane Ladner had not earned this Purple Heart. And we wanted to get him out of law enforcement because if he was not a felon, he could stay in law enforcement, get another job. Here in the South, some of these agencies, small agencies, if you've got a certification, they'll take you because they're desperate for officers. And we see guys bounce around with bad reputations like that. So we got him out of law enforcement. We proved to the world that he was a fraud. Here's one of the catches of this case, Jerry, is that sometimes people say, why didn't he just plead guilty? We have our own theory why he didn't just plead guilty. He and his wife settled with the train company. I believe it was Pacific Railroad or something, some large name railroad that you would recognize. and they settled for her lost leg and her injuries. And he was also awarded a settlement, but you can imagine hers would have been pretty substantial because of her lost leg. I was informed by the prosecutors that if he would have admitted that he was lying and that he never earned the Purple Heart, then he would have had to forfeit the settlement, the financial settlement from the train accident. So he can be a felon. He can be convicted that he was lying, but it does not overturn the civil settlement. Only thing that can overturn the civil settlement is if he admits that he was lying. So sadly, he gets to keep the money that he was awarded during the train wreck that caused his wife to lose her leg. There were people that knew from the very beginning that he did not deserve this Purple Heart, but they didn't bring it forward or they didn't take it to the next level. They just kind of rolled their eyes and shook their head. But ultimately, it caused his wife to lose her leg. And I'll have you know that they're still happily married today. She believes him. She believes that he deserved to be on that parade float. She believes that this is a conspiracy against her husband. And she believes that the Army lost his one BD-214 that would vindicate him.
But for the rest of his life, all he needs to do is look at his wife and her missing leg to remind him the consequences of his actions.
Yeah, we often think, how does a person like that live with themselves? But as you well know from all the many other people that you've interviewed, it's hard to get inside the minds of criminals sometimes, and sometimes you just can't do it.
Well, thank you for sharing this case.
Yeah, it was a great way to finish my career. It was the last case I worked, and it was really a team effort. It was my first time to testify in a state trial.
Some people, like that judge that you mentioned, will say, so what? As a veteran, could you kind of sum up why these cases are important to investigate and charge?
Sure. I could think of two, maybe three reasons why they are. One, America honors its heroes. And one of the ways we honor our heroes in the military is through awards. We also honor our first responders, and we have a different award system and recognition for that. But in the military, it's through the medals process. So when someone fraudulently claims a medal, America's getting cheated a little bit. It takes away from what they want to see in their heroes. And then secondly is the actual heroes themselves. The stories that people have of being injured or their acts of valor on the battlefield, the books and movies are made about those. And then to have someone come along and take away from them just ever so slightly by saying, oh yeah, I also did that. I was also there. And it turns out to be a lie, takes away from them. So that would be the second. And then third, there's normally going to be a financial loss. So if you want to look at this just strictly by the numbers, who's the victim here? Once again, it goes back to the people. And in this case, it can go back to the government or it can go back to a veterans organization, which represents the people because the charitable donations that they receive. So there's a couple, three ways that there are victims here and certainly makes these cases worthy.
Well, the one thing that comes away from your review of the Stolen Valor cases is that you were able to use your FBI career to honor your military service. We're at the point now where I ask you when you joined the FBI and why you joined the FBI.
I joined in July of 1997, came from the Marine Corps. I was only out 45 days between the Marine Corps and the FBI. I was not prepared to leave the Marine Corps. I was very happy in the Marines. Marines like to think that we're the best of the best, if you will. If I was going to leave the Marines, I was going to go into law enforcement, but I was also only going to do it with the best of the best. And I politely say that the FBI is the best law enforcement agency. And so if the Bureau was going to take me, I would be willing to make that transfer. But had the Bureau not taken me, I would have finished my career in the Marines.
You served in the FBI for how many years?
20 years and 6 months from 97 to 2017.
And what are you doing now?
I am teaching with the FBI as a contractor on a part-time basis back up in the Fredericksburg, Quantico area, teaching at one of the Intel schools.
I also understand that you have your own consulting firm.
I do. I work with nonprofits, specifically with churches. And in my career, as an agent, I did a lot of active shooter training and instruction for law enforcement guys and so forth as the Bureau became more and more involved in that after the shootings up in Newtown and so forth. So the Bureau started classifying some agents as active shooter instructors. And so I wanted to parlay that over to the civilian side and work with people who are not gun toters and who are not in the security realm, if you will. So I just go and educate churches on here's what to do if something happens at your church, or maybe I talk to a civic group. Here's what happens if something happens during one of your meetings or something to that effect, and just try and pass on a little bit of training that I received in the Bureau.
And what's the name of your consulting firm?
I68.org, and the I is like Isaiah, and the 68 would be like chapter 6, verse 8, which is a kind of a famous verse, Isaiah 6:8 in the Bible, where Isaiah raises his hand and volunteers to go and help. So law enforcement and military use that verse a lot. I kind of condensed it to I68.org.
All right. I will make sure to have a link to your website, your Active Shooter Consulting Church and Workplace website, in the show notes for this episode.
Thank you.
All right. So we're at the end now, and I always like to give my guest the last word. So what would you like to say?
Well, it's easy for me, Jerry. Thank you for allowing me to tell your audience about this, but also thank you for just keeping these cases, all the cases that you've interviewed folks about, keeping them out there in the forefront for education purposes and all the positive benefits that go with these case reviews. So thank you.
And that's the end of the interview. At jerrywilliams.com, you'll find a photo of Mark Sewell. You'll find links to articles about all of the military medals and stolen valor, as well as news reports about the investigation of Shane Ladner. There are photos of the Medal of Honor and the Purple Heart. There is a photo of Shane Ladner in his dress uniform, wearing all of his medals and ribbons, legitimate and otherwise, and of his DD-214 military discharge papers presented as evidence in court. And there's also a photo of Mark Sewell and Governor Dill taken when the Georgia Stolen Valor state law was signed. I hope you enjoyed the episode and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. If they're not sure how to listen to a podcast, have them read the post on my website, How to Listen to a Podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to FBI Retired Case File Review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. I would also love it if you checked out the link for my books in your podcast app's description of this episode. My nonfiction books, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, a manual for armchair detectives, which goes through 20 cliches and misconceptions about the FBI in books, TV, and movies. And then there's the companion book, FBI Word Search Puzzles, Fun for Armchair Detectives. My FBI Philadelphia Corruption Squad crime series features flawed female FBI agent Carrie Wheeler in Pay to Play and Greedy Givers. All of my books are available wherever books are sold as ebooks, print books, and audiobooks. If you've already picked up copies of my books, please consider leaving a review. Reviews help readers find good books. Thank you for listening to the very end, and I hope you come back again for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.